this is skipping ahead a little bit in sort of the new director training process. However, most of the centers are preparing for these fiscal reviews right now, so I thought it would be appropriate and make sure that this is timely and you have the information you need when you need it. So the grant here closed December 31st of 2016, and as I'm sure you know, you're working to finalize your fourth quarter invoices. And we're working on our end to assist with that review process and get them to our accounting office. And I've sent out a information request to all of your centers, and we've asked for information to be submitted to us by February 23rd. Yes, February 23rd. And so today we'll walk through what that information is that we've requested up front, and then what questions will be asked on site. So I will start going through the slides and turn off the video so it's less distracting here. Okay. And one thing about Zoom meetings, I'm still getting familiar with them, but there should be a button on your screen if you want to unmute yourself, and you can ask questions as we go through this process and make sure you have an understanding of how this system, how it works, as far as what questions you need to ask to make sure that you're able to accomplish what you need to accomplish at your specific site. Okay, so financial reviews or fiscal reviews, they can be called both things. All right, so one thing to kind of think about is that actually the lead center is constantly monitoring for compliance throughout the year. So it's not just an annual site visit that we do compliance, but it's throughout the year. You turn in 4 quarterly invoices. We're looking at the general ledger support. We're asking questions as needed. And we have the discretion to ask for additional invoices and detailed receipts whenever we want to see that, payroll documents, etc., if we have questions. When a new center comes on, or a center that it's high risk, that there's been different changes that have happened at the center, a new host, new directors sometimes, that we can ask for full support documentation. So Alameda would be an example right now. They're a new host and they are submitting full backup documentation for at least the first year. And that's to ensure that they have systems in place on the accounting side, and we can see what those systems are, and they're able to do fund accounting, segregate expenses, and we feel comfortable with that system. So after the grant period closes, the lead center sends out a request for documents to be submitted electronically for review prior to the site visit. And from the review of these documents, the lead center will begin drafting the annual fiscal review report. And so we'll go over what this information request is. And just if you can think about, I'm going to be coming for a half a day to a day, depending on how long it takes. And so that's a lot of, a whole year's worth of information to be digesting and looking at. And I want to be able to sit and have a conversation with the directors and the accounting staff and be able to be present with them. And if I don't have the documents ahead of time, then I'm rifling through paper and I'm not able to really sit and have a conversation. I'm trying to tick and tie and break out a calculator, and having to do that while having people watch me, which I'd rather just do in the privacy of my own office and not have to, waste your time, basically. Let me open information request and do one page. All right, so we are asking that the information on this list be submitted by February 23rd and that it be submitted to Dropbox. We have a regional Dropbox, and that it have a naming convention for the file names. A lot of times, if someone drags a document into Dropbox and they scanned it and it's got a whole bunch of numbers after it and some cryptic name, that's hard for us to know what it is. So if you can please assist us with doing a naming convention. And the convention starts off with a number. So we're trying to line up number 1 lines up with number 1 on this list. If there's any questions about that, please let me know. So the first thing on the list is prior year reviews and audits. And the bullet points under this is most recent SBDC financial review, including management's response to findings. So that is the report that I wrote the prior year. And if you can't find that in your files, then let me know and I'll resend it to you. And so look at that and ensure that you have a copy of that. Of course, I have a copy of it too, but the exercise here is that I want to know that you're keeping a copy of it, you're reviewing it, your team is implementing any changes that needed to be made, revising policy and procedures, for example, and that it hasn't just, gotten shoved to the bottom of the drawer and forgotten. Most recent host external independent audit report. So that would be something that in my world, I would be contacting Sponsored Programs Foundation and asking for their A133 audit. And they would submit to Washington, D.C. So each person has a different, for a nonprofit, for example, who you would ask. You would be asking, your firm probably that did your audit from last year, or if you're at a community college, asking your business or accounting office for the most recent audit report.
Sean, this is Marianne. Your screen is gray, so we can't see.
Oh, it is.
Hi, Sean. I think you have to click when you share the screen to the document. If you click on that screen where the document is showing.
Oh, okay. Thank you, my tech helper here. I'm still getting used to this Zoom thing. What did I do wrong? Okay, hold on here. Okay, so sharing. You share. Okay. I was just thinking that I was. Right, is that working, you guys?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I opened a new document, but on the same screen, but that's not how Zoom works, so. Okay, thanks. All right, so number 1, let me know if there's any questions. Number 2, organization. So a couple different things about organizations. The address of the facilities, if you have satellite locations, for example, or outreach locations, list those. Organizational chart through host reporting responsibility and titles. And this would be something that would have been submitted with your proposal. That would be a good place to look for that. And it might need to be updated as well if there's been changes. For instance, Mendocino has a new director. chart of accounts. So that would be where there's, depending on your world, things can be called different things. I know at some centers it might be called orgs, or it might be called different things, but a chart of accounts would be how you segregate activities. So is there a certain account that you use for travel or payroll or telecom, different types of activities, and that's what you segregate it as. Service Center SBDC Policies and Procedures Manual. And now that we're moving to more online systems, this might be a bit outdated, I'm not sure, but so as a service center, you should have certain policies and procedures that your advisors should have access to. And in the past, we had a physical binder that was in each service center, and it had the policies and procedures in it. It had the regional policies, and then you would put your local service center policies. If you've moved that to an online setting for people, that's okay. But just how do advisors and other staff know what the SBDC and your service center policies and procedures are, and how do they have access? And then I need to see a copy of it. Hosts Policies and Procedures Manual. So that could be that maybe they're online, they're on a website, and you can give me links to those policies and procedures, or you can download copies of them. I'm open. There's a couple ones that I want to ensure that I have. You can give me more, but particularly that you have a cash handling policy, purchasing, travel, conflict of interest, program income, so revenue, equipment, record retention, fixed assets, which are related to computers and how you track technology purchases. And then 3 and 4 are about the SBDC budget. So list of individuals with check signing authority. And this is about managing the SBDC funds as well as at the host level. So some questions I get about this sometimes are at community colleges, for example, that they'll say, well, the SBDC director signs off on the invoice and says that it's approved and there's Neosera support and that it's a legitimate SBDC related expense, but that SBDC director can't sign off on actual checks that are cut. That's the vice president. That makes sense. And so I would you could just list that delineation that the SBDC, the role the SBDC director has versus the role that someone else higher up has. General ledgers for the full fiscal or calendar years. So this is recognizing that people have different accounting systems. I know that Mendocino's accounting system is on a calendar year, so that's easy for them. Some systems, Humboldt State included, and community colleges are going to be on a fiscal year. So that makes it more difficult to reconcile. And we're wanting to, if it gets, the reason to do this is to double check that at year end, kind of in the spring, we've been seeing these quarterly invoices for 3 months at a time, January through March, April through June. And so, okay, the general ledger support lines up when we do 3 months at a time, but then at the end of the grant period, after there's been some transfers and different things, can we pull a full general ledger report and it still balances to all those different 3-month reports? And that we're, at zero, or we're, at the same numbers that were turned in at each of the quarterly periods. I hope that makes sense, and let me know if there's questions. List of periodic financial management reports reviewed by the director. So this would be, what are the reports that directors are reviewing monthly, and what are they called? Is it a budget to actuals report? What is it in your world that is helping you to manage your spend down of your grants? And you can submit an example of those reports if you want to, as well as just naming them. Then number 5, year-end allocation procedures, verification of expenses. And under this, you would give a list of account and cost center numbers assigned for the calendar year. So at HSU, these are called funds. We do fund accounting, and we have a list of funds for my federal money, my federal SBA money. I have a separate fund. And then for GoBiz, I have a separate fund, and for program income, I have a separate fund. And so I would list all those different fund numbers that I have. That might be called something else at your host. So, but giving a list of all the different buckets of money or places that you might charge expenses. Number 6, quarterly invoicing policies and compliance, and this would be discussed and reviewed on site. So it's not necessarily something that you have to submit right now, but it would just kind of keep in the back of your mind that when it's time to process quarterly invoices, what's the process? What's the role that the director has? What's the role that accounting has? What happens if you find something that needs to be adjusted and a journal entry needs to happen? Who approves that? Things like that. Number 7, expense processing policies and procedures. Again, this is a discussion on site. So talking through if you get an invoice from an advisor or any other expense, what are the steps that happen and the double checks that happen to ensure accuracy and compliance. Number 8, program income. List of program income balances from prior year and tied out to general ledger. This ends up being a bit tricky for some of the centers. I know not everyone is tracking program income. But what this is doing is ensuring that we're having program income balances roll over from year to year. So you're going to look at the bottom line number on your Q4 invoice for program income. And let's just say that you have, you had some revenue come in, you had some expenditures this last year, and then that left you $10,000. And so then I'm asking, can you produce a report that shows in spring of 2017 that you have that $10,000? And sometimes with centers that have fiscal year accounting particularly, that gets a bit tricky to show that specific number. And so then we're going to start off the year for 2017 with that rollover balance. And for people at community colleges, in the past, there's been a concern that if you're getting funds from the chancellor's, community colleges normally are funded with money from, state funds, chancellor's office, and they would sweep funds at the end of the fiscal year. And program income funds cannot be swept and kind of put into the college coffers. And so that's one of the reasons we're also trying to make sure that the information ties out and it doesn't get taken away by your host as just part of their end of year processes. And we would run a list of training classes that were provided during the last year, so January through December 2016, and program income trainings. So you're going to pick 2 training files that will be tested from November or the nearest dates during the site visit. So in if, let's say, you didn't do a training in November, you did a training in October or a training in December. So then those would be the ones that I'll look at when I come on site. And I'm going to be reviewing that certain information is in the program income training files. So there's the 888 form that shows how much money is collected, and I need to be able to reconcile that to the general ledger. And this is another thing which ends up being difficult for a lot of centers, is if you only collected $20 from a training, I still need to be able to find where is that $20 on the general ledger to ensure that it was deposited into the program income account and trace that. Are there any questions about that? All right. Indirect rate letter, a copy of your indirect rate letter. So this would have been submitted with your proposal. And if you can't find it, we have copies because you submitted it to us. So let us know. But we want to make sure that you also are keeping a copy and understand it, and we can talk about it more at the site visit if you do have questions about indirect rates. In-kind match documentation. So if you declared anything besides waived indirect for in-kind match, then we want to see you're claiming the amount claimed on your Q4 invoice, but you need to submit other documentation as well. So just you're kind of giving another copy, but we're just going to look at it and go over it at the review and discuss, was this documentation the best documentation? Do you have questions about it? What are other sources of in-kind match? And just kind of ensure that you have a good understanding of it. Record retention. So you should have a policy about record retention. The minimum record retention for the SBA grant is that you need to keep records for 3 years after the final payment. So for 2016, we're processing your final invoice now, and it'll go down to accounting in February. They have 30 days to process a check. So you'll probably get a check in March. So then you would keep your 2016 records for 3 years from March. And you might have policies that are longer than that, but that would be the minimum. Statement of directors' concerns, comments regarding the HSU host or the SBDC program or their own host, the lead center, just a statement of any concerns, and you can provide that ahead of time or we can discuss it on site. So it's just a time to touch base and what's working, what's not working, and if it's something that's not working well at the lead center, how can we address it? If it's something that is not working well with your host, is there some way that the lead center can be supportive? Things like that. 13, cash match funds, cash match documentation and contract review, including summary of cash match claimed for calendar year. And I think this is a little bit of a typo for calendar year, I think, statement. And that you already have, actually, because you submit that as your final page of the invoice where it says match sources. So you're going to have a summary of your cash match claimed. And then the sources of funds, ledger number, and amount claimed. So that's also part of that final page of your Q4 invoice. And then from that, we're going to look at the contracts or written agreements, including host contracts. So sometimes I'm thinking Contra Costa had some examples, and that they have funds allocated to them from their host. So there might be that there's a budget that needs to show an allocation to the SBDC, that money is set aside, that's not going to get taken away or allocated to something else, or some agreements that might be as part of the host agreements. Verification that all match, including host, is eligible for federal funding, and name of person from host who can verify this. So this is a statement just saying, you know, I verify that all match is eligible for federal funding, and I'm not sure who that would be at each of your centers. It's usually someone in the accounting department that would do that, or maybe someone higher up than that. And it's important because we need to really make sure. I'm trying to think of an example. There's been funds in the past that have been Caltrans funds, for example, or there's another like social services, Cal something, and people have thought that, oh, that must be state funding and we can use it as match. And it wasn't true. And someone in their accounting department knew that, and it wasn't necessarily someone in the service center that knew it. So that's why we're wanting to make sure that the service center and the accounting staff are talking to each other, and there's this verification that we swear this is all, you know, legitimate match, and we're not making any mistakes when we're reporting it to Washington. Sample financial data review. Okay, so this is something that I'm going to be sending out this week, and as we've been processing your quarterly invoices, we've been choosing a couple transactions when we look at the general ledger each quarter. And then I'm going to send that list to you. And if you can work with your accounting staff to pull the backup documentation for that list, it'll be about 10 documents. And this will just be a sampling of, were the invoices coded correctly, or check requests written properly? Did they have the director sign off on them? All the different things that should be happening according to your policies and procedures. Are those steps all being followed? And personnel, list of employees for the calendar year. So which employees did you have on payroll for 2016? List of amounts paid for each employee for calendar year, which should tie to the W-2s. Rate of pay and time cards, and this is for January through March. So this is part of the sampling that for number 14, that I'm going to be giving you a list of invoices and receipts to pull. Part of this is also choosing a quarter's worth of payroll documents to look at. And so this year I'm going to look at January through March for the Q1. For employee business advisors, provide Neosera reports that show the hours entered. I think that only applies to, well, it applies to a couple centers actually, Napa and Silicon Valley. Time cards must clearly identify SBDC projects, and only those SBDC projects can use SBDC funds or matching funds. So how are time cards identifying where payroll is being charged? Or there could be a letter of effort, which primarily this is at community colleges. But if you have a question about, it's really, if you don't submit a time card and there's just no other documentation, then you probably would be doing a letter of effort if you don't have to submit a time card to get paid. fringe, host policies and procedures regarding fringe benefits, and if you have a rate sheet, travel requests and claims for the director. So if you can put those in Dropbox so that I can review those as a sampling of where the director's been traveling, because that's charged to the grant most likely. And also the other thing I look for is, are travel expenses for the director signed off by a 1-up? Because sometimes, especially in the smaller centers, that's doesn't always happen, or it can get overlooked. So that's another thing I'm looking for. Any additional sample transactions requested. So in the list of sample transactions I'm going to email this week, there could be some other travel expenses that I have noted in there. Okay. D, equipment, list of equipment and location. So if there's any equipment that has been purchased with SBDC funds, so that would be the federal cash match or program income, then it needs to be listed on the equipment list, which should have been turned in at the end of 2016. It's a form that should have been filled out and submitted. Let me know if you have questions about that. So it's only for equipment that's purchased with funds that are reflected on the quarterly invoices. And it needs to be tracked sort of indefinitely. If it gets to the point that the stuff is so old that it gets surplused out at your host, you can note that. Supplies, it would just be submitting some of the transactional samples that I'll be emailing out. And then F, contractual consultants, list of contractors, consultants for the calendar year. So this would be for anyone who hires consultants as independent contractors, just to clarify, because if you hire them as employees, we've already covered that under personnel. So this would be just for centers that hire consultants, business advisors as independent contractors. But there might be someone else that you contract with that maybe you contracted with someone to do, gosh, I'm trying to think. Well, probably not web page stuff, since we're Lead Center's doing web page stuff, but on our invoices at Lead Center, we would have a contractor line item for web page. We would also have a contractor line item for someone that might do strategic planning at our region meetings. So just however that would relate in your world. There could be other reasons you would have contractual expenses. List of amounts paid to each consultant for the calendar year. And this may or may not exactly tie to the 1099. I realize that because of end of year invoices. So for example, a December 2016 invoice might get submitted in January and paid in 2017, but it should approximately tie, or there should be kind of an explanation of why it's, not quite tying. List of vendors, including consultants with cumulative spending greater than $5,000. Attach supporting documentation showing the host's purchasing rules were adhered to. So, does your host have any rules around competitive bidding, or that if you have a vendor that you're spending more than $5,000 or $1,000 or $10,000, whatever the threshold is, that you need to set up a purchase order or sole source justification, or whatever the rules are in your accounting world, just to prove that you are following those for some of your larger vendors. submit sample transactions and include SARA report that shows the hours entered for business advisors and trainers. And so many of the centers, maybe most at this point, I believe, already have SARA reports attached to invoices from their advisors, just as a way to reconcile that the hours were worked. But if for some reason that's not the case, then please make sure that you do have the SARA reports as well. And facilities, if facilities were charged to the grant, again, federal or cash match, then you should have a lease agreement, a blueprint, or some other way to document what the square footage is, and a market rate comparison. So this is important because we want to make sure that all of the SBDC offices we're not paying higher than the market rate. So would a prudent taxpayer think that this is a fair price for us to be paying for facilities? And so that's how SBA determines if it's a fair price, is that we get a market rate comparison. You can look on Craigslist or any other kind of commonly available source of information and look for places that are for rent for the approximate square footage, and just see how that compares for your situation. I can send you an example if that's helpful, but it's the idea. So that's it. So I've been doing a lot of talking. Are there any questions about any of that? Okay.
Sean, this is Mary Ann Petrillo from Minnesota.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm new to this, and I'm looking at last year's documentation and following you on this phone call. I'm just curious, in a lot of the sections that are indicated on this document form that you've just gone through, is that information supposed to be put into a specific form, or is it just something we put on a Word document and give to you? So the things I'm looking at, for instance, organization, address of facilities, does that go on a piece of paper, or is there a form that section 2 fits all that information into?
You could just put it in a Word document. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not fancy. Some centers have, I think Santa Cruz last year had kind of a good system that they took my information request and they typed the information into the information request. And so under addresses, they just typed the addresses into the information request. And then in other areas, they said, see Dropbox and put the name of the document or something like that. I mean, that's one way. Or you can, what we do for when we have to turn in information to SBA for Washington, for the regional reviews, is we would put a Word document for each item. So it'd be, number 2 addresses, and we would just list the addresses and turn it in, and it would just all be labeled nicely, and we upload it to a portal, but so that it's like, okay, that's question 2, this is document 2. They can just go through on a checklist and check that they asked for 50 things, they have 50 things, and do it that way. So I'm open to what works for you. Yeah. Any other questions?
No, thank you for that. I was just going to put each of these groups in a folder, folder 1, folder 2, etc.
Yeah.
Content in there. And I'll use that system where it's scanned files, then that's what I'll upload to Dropbox and then have corresponding folder. So that's fine. I wanted to make sure there wasn't a form I was supposed to have.
No. Yeah. No, thanks. And I mean, and I think we started this kind of Dropbox system last year. We used to do paper binders, and we're trying to move away from paper. And I'm also hopeful that now there's a starting place so that the centers can go into last year's Dropbox and say, oh, the policies haven't changed. The different documents haven't changed. We'll just pull them over into the next year's file and then add a couple of things like in the proposal file, which is maybe electronic and maybe in Dropbox, pull over the org chart from that and try to make it less time consuming for all of us. That's my hope. Okay, so site visit. So I'll be doing a week of travel in March and another one in May, or March, April, and May. I just kind of scheduled that I'm going to be out of the office for a week each month. And I'll meet with the service center directors as well as the host accounting staff to discuss questions related to last year's operations, challenges, financial reporting, and management. And so there's questions that I'll ask, and I'm gonna, kind of thinking about time, I'll show you what those questions are and I can follow up and email them to you. But I just wanna not take up too much of your time here. Okay. Let me do the share screen correctly. Hopefully that is. Information request, and then okay, is this working? You guys are seeing a Word document?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it starts off with this generic letter that's going to go to Kathleen Butler Tom, and she's our project officer in San Francisco, and a copy also goes to Washington, D.C. each year. And it also goes to your center's host and our host. And so this is part of our compliance documentation that's required by the SBDC grant, is that we do these annual visits. So just kind of generic letter that Kristen and I both sign. And then it goes through kind of the key points are, we'll list who the key personnel are that we met with, so the service center director and the host accounting staff. And this will be the section about the financial review, just another sort of disclaimer. And then we'll look at the prior year audit review findings and management responses. So this is going to line up, if I did it right and got my numbering correctly, exactly with the information request. So number one on this report is going to be number one on the information request. So we've kind of talked about each of those topics already. So prior year audit review, we'll discuss that. And then number two, organization. Number three, budget. So, etc. I don't think there's some kind of more detailed questions in here that are discussion points. But I think we kind of talked about the key points already. So, yeah. And this is number 12. Does the director have any concerns or comments regarding host SBDC program lead center? That is. And then cash match contract and sample financial transaction review. Okay, so that's that. Okay. Okay, so the top 10 findings list. So this was something I thought would be useful to share. It's a little bit dated in that I received this from one of the national conferences several years ago now. And the director of the examiner's office in Washington, D.C. had prepared this list of the top 10 findings that the Washington, D.C. examiners find when they go out and do their site visits. And so there's references to the OMB circulars and things like that, which have now morphed into uniform guidance and stuff. But still, the findings, I'm sure, are still very similar. And I thought it would be worth sharing. And you have to keep in mind that this is directed towards lead centers. So the way some of this wording happens, it's addressed to me submitting documentation to Washington, D.C. But everything you submit, needs to be appropriate, and in order to make sure that what I submit to Washington, D.C. is okay. So, all right, here we go. Finding number 1, the amount of indirect costs reimbursed by federal funds, which in this example was $50,000, exceeds the amount authorized on the notice of award, $40,000. The difference of $10,000 cannot be paid with federal funds and is disallowed. And the recourse was that the SBDC region, which, in this case would be Humboldt State sponsored programs, is the host of our region because they have the master contract. So if this was Humboldt State would have to send Washington a check for $10,000. And so I'm gonna just pick on Mendocino for a minute, if that's okay, Marianne, that I felt a little bit sheepish having to bug your center when I was doing quarterly invoices because the indirect was a couple cents off. And I know that that's just so irritating when I have to write to you guys and say, oh, please revise this invoice. It's a couple cents off on either the indirect that's being charged to the federal grant or even the waived indirect. But the reality is that it's disallowed. Even any cent, anything over the amount that that's in our contract with SBA is just not allowed. So it has to be perfect, and especially at closeout, it really has to be perfect. So apologies, but I hope this kind of helps you to understand that as well. So we're not allowed to go even $1 over what the indirect is in our master contract. All right, finding number 2, the amount of waived indirect, $500,000, exceeded the amount of non-federal funds authorized for indirect on the notice of awards, $400,000. $100,000 is disallowed as an expense of non-federal funds. And so further clarification is that the notice of award, general terms and conditions, actions requiring prior approval. Before taking any of the following actions, you must obtain advance approval from SBA, changes to the amount claimed for indirect costs in excess of the approved budget. So I guess they're sort of citing why this is not allowed. And in this case, the SBDC network must revise this one document, SF425, which is a federal financial report. So again, the waived indirect cannot be over either. And waived indirect counts as match. So if we end up being undermatched because we misreported our waived indirect, we would, in certain instances, have to repay that and actually write a check as well. Finding 3, the reimbursement invoices for an SBDC service center do not reconcile to the general ledger. So that's where, you know, close enough does not work. It has to be perfect, and we need to have general ledger support for all expenses. And there's the reference, well, the old reference before the uniform guidance. State in part recipients' financial management systems shall provide for accurate, current, and complete disclosure of financial results of each federally sponsored project. The lead center should require SBDC service centers to enhance their financial reporting system. Program income. Program income funds were diverted from SBDC program for expenses for non-SBDC activities. So this is why sometimes program income, it's not that much money, but SBA is watching it very closely because it is revenue from participants, and they really want to make sure that it stays with the program. And so it's giving references to why, you know, it should not be diverted, and that we need to have effective controls and accountability for all funds, property, and other assets. Recipients shall adequately safeguard all such assets and ensure they are used solely for authorized purposes. The lead center must provide evidence that the SBDC service center has replenished the program income account in the amount of the disallowed expenditures. The lead center must assure that safeguards have been installed to prevent this situation from occurring again. 5, the daily timesheet that is used for time and effort reporting only records time worked in support of the SBDC program. The employees who allocate their time to other programs do not record 100% of their time on the SBDC daily timesheet. This is a question that comes up so often at centers when there's sort of a changeover in accounting staff maybe, or directors, and they maybe don't have a system in place already for recording their the time that they work, and so we have to work with them to get that set up. And it's like, well, okay, I documented that I worked, you know, this amount of time on the SBDC grant and the cash match grant, and I also have a women's business center program, or I have a different one, and I charge some of my time to that, but I'm not including that because it's not SBDC related. But what SBA is asking for is they want to see a timesheet that shows that, you know, if you got paid $1,000, they want to see all the different funds or buckets of money that $1,000 was split up into, and how many hours were charged to each bucket of money. So OMB circulars require recording of the total activity for which employees are compensated and which is required to fulfill the obligations to the organization. The SBDC network develops and implements. So what should be happening is SBDC network develops and implements a process to record 100% of employee time. Okay, 6, the required financial reports were not submitted within SBA's specified dates. So there's a semi-annual report that SBA requires that's submitted July 30th. And then there's a final report that's submitted 90 days after the conclusion of the year. And so that's the deadline we're working with right now, is that the grant ended in December and you're working on your quarterly invoices. You're going to get them finalized no later than February 15th, because then I'm going to have to be buying presents for the accounting staff at HSU, begging them to please rush and get the invoices posted in February. And then our February closed reports, I'm not going to get them until like March 15th if I'm lucky. And then I need to do regional, summary reports, etc., and have all of that complete and reviewed and signed off by our host and submitted by March 30th. So, and we can't submit late. It's not an option. In a review of time and effort for employees at the lead center and selected service centers in program year 2012, the time and effort certification documents reviewed were dated June 2013, indicating they were certified after the fact and not in 2012 when they should have been certified. This is something that happens on a pretty regular basis too for centers that submit letters of effort. So if you submit a time card, there's a time card, I do, that I have to submit something every 2 weeks. And so there's going to be an accurate date on it. But I know at community colleges, if you're a salaried staff person, I think by default you get paid. And then you only submit a report showing absences, I believe. And so in that case, we do a letter of effort. And a lot of times people don't think about doing their letters of effort until it's time to do the fiscal reviews. And so they're starting to think about them now. And then they're going to have this date on them that says, February 2017, when actually they should have 2016 dates on them. Finding 8, a review of transactions from the general ledger of the SBDC revealed expenses of $1,000 for food and catering for grand opening and an open house of a service center. $1,000 is disallowed from cash match. So unallowable advertising and public relations costs include the following: costs of meetings, conventions, convocations, or other events related to other activities of the nonprofit organization. So then the remedy is that the SBDC should review cost principles and develop policies and procedures outlining allowable expenses. So this is particularly a tricky area, that anything that's especially about hospitality and advertising, it's helpful for us to kind of check in about ahead of time, because SBA has an eagle eye for that. When I had them here for an on-site review, I think they pulled like every restaurant transaction in their transaction sampling. It was just, they're very clued in that sometimes it's okay for food to be charged, like when we do a region meeting. And I have a specific policy about that we had to get a specific ruling on it. But other than region meetings, they don't want to see, wining and dining being charged on the grant. And that means even for cost match, that anything that you wouldn't charge directly to the federal money, you need to use those same rules when looking at the cash match.
Sean, this is Marianne. On that last one, it says unallowable advertising, and public relations. Do they define marketing or sending a flyer out? Is any of that?
So it needs to be the definitions around this that I've heard for advertising is that you need to be specifically advertising the services. So one example that came up recently in the last year was there was a service center that was moved to a new host. And there was a big, very expensive advertisement taken out in the paper, showing that they're having an open house and that, we're in a new location. And that is not allowable, even though it's like, but of course you need to tell people that. I mean, yeah, I get it, but it's not saying. So anyway, that's that. And then there's another situation where if you're offering a training or you're trying to get the word out about your services and you're specifically stating, we provide, business counseling, or having this training on such and such a date, contact us at this phone number or this website, and you're providing kind of the who, what, where, why, how of your core services, that is allowable. Does that make sense?
Staying with that for a second, the who, what, where, when, why. So does that mean that printing a flyer, I'm not talking about advertising now, I'm not talking about like advertising in a paper or even in a social channel, but the actual creation of the materials so that you can then hand the card to people and say, here, come to our training on Tuesday. That would all be covered. That would all be allowable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just when it, and I know it's frustrating because there's been a couple situations where there's been open houses and trying to get the community to know that the service center has moved or something like that. But this grant is very restrictive, and I'll hear it from my host all the time that, I mean, it's a fairly large grant for them, but for the onerous oversight that they have to do for it, they are just, oh my gosh, they have a lot larger grants that don't require all this nitpicky, cross your T's, dot your I's, double check for $1 of indirect, all this stuff, which, it even makes me crazy, having to do this sometimes of like, really, is this a good use of time? But it's just, those are the rules for this particular grant.
Right, and I can understand that. I just think that there is, putting advertising and public relations aside, there's a lot that can be done in terms of marketing. And I didn't want to make an assumption that that was also included under advertising and public relations, because advertising and public relations are different.
Right.
They're part of that beast, but not. That's only one slice of beast of marketing that you can do, right?
And I think we can talk individually too about
yeah.
situations.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about this? Because this is a topic that is this gray area that comes up fairly often. Okay. All right, 9, the examiner disallowed $10,000 of revenue credited to program income account from an SBDC. Revenue is earned income specifically generated through the conduct of project activities per the program announcement. These funds appear to be donations to the service center and not specifically earned income from programs. Okay, so this also comes up somewhat frequently, and there's been confusion in the past that I'll pick on Alameda this time, that they have small contracts to do trainings in their community. So one of them is with the Berkeley Library, that they will do, I think, maybe 8 trainings, and they'll get $5,000 for doing those 8 trainings. And so they've got a contract, and it provides them with some funds, and that's great. And so then that revenue, that $5,000, would actually go into a cash match fund, even though it's related to some training, but it's it's not $20 from, you know, participants that are attending the training. And if they did, in addition, have that they're charging $20 for everyone who attends the training, that would be the piece that would get deposited in program income revenue. But it's only participants that are attending the trainings that are paying for that. It's the only piece that gets put in there, which is good news for us as a region because we're always looking for cash match. And so then we can charge, we can use the $5,000 as cash match. So it works out well for us, but it's sometimes a confusing point. All right, number 10, a review of transactions from the general ledger of the lead center revealed expenses of $2,000 for embroidered polo shirts. $1,500 is disallowed from cash match, $500 is disallowed from federal funds. The expense required prior written approval from the program manager. Costs of goods or services for personal use of the organization's employees are unallowable regardless of whether the cost is reported as taxable income to the employees. And so the SBDC reviews cost principles and develops policies and procedures outlining allowable costs. So that's, I don't think people would necessarily get confused about that. We have had shirts printed in the past for the region. It's been a couple of years. We've used sponsorship money for that. So I think one time it was for a state conference and we had some funds that were provided, I want to say from an airline maybe, that Southwest or something like that. And so we did not use that as cash match, and it just kind of stayed off the SBDC books. And we did get shirts printed. So that would be kind of the way that you would do that. Okay, so that is it. Any questions? Okay. All right, well, thank you for your attention. So that's a lot of information to take in. And please be in touch with questions about the financial information request if needed, and look at the schedule. All of your financial site visits should be on the region calendar so that you can ensure that you're available for that day, and your host staff, accounting staff are available. Normally how it works is that I'll show up at your site at 9 in the morning and meet with the director initially, go over questions, and then any questions the director and I can't answer, then in the afternoon we can meet with the financial staff and they can help fill in the blanks or provide, you know, if there was a document that happened to be missing, and maybe they can help with that or something. And the more organized you are up front with providing the information request, the shorter the visit is. So sometimes the visit can, you know, it won't be all day. It'll be, you know, done at 2 o'clock or something. Okay.